Let's get something out of the way right at the start. This episode isn't a lecture. It's not a history class. It's not a both sides parade of feel-good fog. This episode starts with a name, a real life, and a real death. His name was Alex Pretti, a 37-year-old ICU nurse at a Veterans Affairs hospital in Minneapolis. A guy who spent his life caring about people so deeply that he didn't just save lives for a living. He showed up for protests because he thought people were being hurt by how this country was treating them. And on January 24th, Alex was shot and killed by a U.S. Border Patrol agent during a federal immigration enforcement operation in Minneapolis. And I want that to sink in. It didn't happen in some far-off war zone or in a third world country somewhere, and not in some dystopian fantasy, but in a U.S. city, in broad daylight, another U.S. citizen killed by federal agents here on American soil. And here's where this episode really begins. Because you see, right after it happened, they started telling a story about it. A story that was rushed, polished, and convenient before the evidence was even in. Before the videos was widely seen. Before any independent review could breathe. Before anyone had a clear picture of what really went down. Officials told the world that Alex allegedly approached federal agents with a handgun and posed a clear threat. Before the facts had even been fully collected, but videos and eyewitness testimony started painting a completely different picture. A man holding a cell phone, literally just documenting what was going on. Tackled, pepper sprayed, pinned, and executed. That's not narrative framing. That is the grim reality of evidence contradicting the first official story. So if you're about to hear me talk about history rhyming, or language shaping violence, or power justifying itself before the facts are even collected, then let me be clear. This is why I'm talking about it. And not because this is a political issue, not because we're trying to score any kind of points, and not because we enjoy picking at the scabs of public discourse, but because a man who healed people for a living was murdered by the very agents of the state who claimed they were acting to keep people safe. And that contradiction, the rush to justification over truth, is not peripheral to what we're unpacking in this episode. It's the central beat. And it is exactly the kind of story history likes to rhyme. So let's talk about why that matters, why it hurts, and why we have to be honest about what we're actually seeing. And just a quick note before I get going. This episode is not the regularly scheduled one. You see, I had something else planned. Something scheduled. Something much lighter. Something easier. But I scrapped it. Because you see, every now and then something happens where sitting back and sticking to the content calendar just feels wrong. And this was one of those moments, among many. I couldn't watch what was unfolding, read what was being said, and see how fast the narrative was hardening, and just keep quiet. That's not why I started this show. This episode exists because sometimes paying attention matters more than sticking to the plan. You see, sometimes silence feels like complicity, and I'm not interested in any of that. So yeah, we'll get back to the regularly scheduled nerd stuff, the games, the movies, the deep dives, the nostalgia, all that fun stuff. It's still coming. But this one, it just couldn't wait. Because if you believe context matters, if you believe power should be questioned, and if you believe people deserve the truth before the spin, then you do not get to just shrug and move on. All right? Let's get into it. Hey, and welcome to, or welcome back to, the Average Joe Nerdcast. I'm Nate, your resident Average Joe, and today's episode is just a little different, and not necessarily because it's off-brand, and not because it's some experimental thing I've pulled out of my ass, but because sometimes what's happening right now deserves much more attention than nostalgia, video games, or movies. And right now, the time we're living in, it's one of those moments. So, this episode is not going to be about politics as a team sport. It's not about outrage for clicks. And it's definitely not about pretending we're smarter than everyone else. It's just about paying attention. Because you see, something is happening. Not just in Minnesota, and not just with federal immigration enforcement, but with how power explains itself, how violence gets justified, and how quickly we're told to move on. You've probably heard this phrase. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Most people treat that like a clever quote, but today we're treating it like a warning. Not because we're saying history is destiny, and not because we're jumping to worst-case scenarios, but because history leaves patterns behind, and ignoring them has never worked out well for literally anyone. We're going to talk about what happened to Alex Pretti. We're going to talk about how fast the official story came out, and how quickly it started falling apart. We're going to talk about language, about justification, about why governments rush to defend themselves before the facts are in. And we're going to talk about why this all feels uncomfortably familiar. Not because it's identical to the past, but because the sequence is. This episode isn't meant to scare you. It's just meant to slow things down, to look clearly at what's being said, what's being done, and what's being asked of the public. Because history doesn't usually collapse overnight. It erodes, one explanation at a time. So if you're here for honesty, context, and a conversation that does not insult your intelligence, then you're in the right place. So let's get into it. First, we need to slow everything down for just a second. Because before we talk about Minnesota, before we talk about federal agents, and before we talk about deaths and lies and power tripping over itself, we need to deal with a sentence that gets tossed around way too casually. You've probably heard it. I've heard it. It's usually said with a little nod, like someone just dropped a whole bucket of wisdom. I said it just a few seconds ago. Do you remember what it was? History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. You see, most people treat that like a fun observation, like, neat. But that sentence isn't meant to be cute. It's meant to make you just a little uncomfortable. Because what it's really saying is this. If you're waiting for history to show up wearing the exact same clothes it wore last time, then you're going to miss it. You see, history doesn't come back as a rerun. It comes back as a remix. Same beat, different lyrics, new justification. And here's why that matters. If history actually repeated, it would be completely obvious. There would be no debate. Same uniforms, same slogans, same symbols. And everyone would say, oh, hell no, not this bullshit again. And they would do something about it. But that's not how it works. History repeats logic, not aesthetics. It repeats fear. It repeats rationalization. It repeats the way people talk themselves into accepting things they would have rejected 5 years earlier. That's the rhyme. And this is where people usually start pushing back just a little, because just saying, this all feels familiar, makes people very nervous. Because you see, familiarity comes with responsibility. If something feels familiar, then maybe you're supposed to notice it. And noticing things means you might have to say something. There's a phrase people love to use when conversations like this start getting just a little uncomfortable. It can't happen here. And I want you to really sit with that sentence. Because that sentence has been said in democracies by educated people. by people who genuinely believed in their country. Not villains, just normal folks who assumed history only moves forward. But history does not move forward. History loves to loop, sometimes slowly, sometimes quietly, and sometimes politely. You don't need an evil government for bad things to happen. You just need a system that gets comfortable explaining itself instead of questioning itself. You just need people tired enough to say, I don't love this, but I guess that's how it is now. That sentence is one of history's favorite rhymes. And here's why this matters right now. Because you see, we live in a moment where power moves fast, explanations move even faster, and truth, well, it's expected to catch up later. We're told to wait, to trust the process, to stop being so dramatic. But history has receipts on that exact approach. Waiting doesn't protect people. Scrutiny does. When people talk about learning from history, they usually mean memorizing dates. That's not the lesson. The lesson is pattern recognition. It's noticing when force gets justified before it's examined, when language gets softer while actions get harder, when accountability gets framed as an inconvenience. Those are not endings. They're beginnings. And that's why this episode exists in the first place. Not because we're saying this is already the worst case scenario, but because the early chapters of bad stories all sound eerily reasonable. I mean, hell, they always do. So when we start talking about Germany, and yeah, we're going there. But this isn't about Nazis, or shock value, or cheap comparisons. It's about trying to understand how normal societies drift into unacceptable behavior without ever flipping a switch. Because once you understand that process, you start seeing it everywhere. And if you want to stop history from finishing a rhyme, then you have to recognize it while it still sounds familiar, before it gets fatal. And this is the part we need to stay in for a bit. Because if I rush this part, then everything else sounds dramatic instead of inevitable. You see, when people talk about Germany in the 30s, they jump straight to the ending, the uniforms, the symbols, the horror. And that jump is comforting, because it lets us tell ourselves a story where the warning signs were obvious. But trust me when I tell you, they weren't. And that's the lesson. You see, Germany after World War I was not a cartoon villain waiting to happen. It was a country that felt broken. And not metaphorically broken. Materially. People had lost jobs. Savings completely evaporated. Money became something you could carry in your hands and still not trust. And when your money stops meaning anything, everything else starts feeling fake too. Like institutions, leaders, and promises. And that kind of instability doesn't make people evil. It just makes them desperate for ground to stand on. And desperation doesn't look like rage all the time. Sometimes it looks like exhaustion. Most people living in Germany at that time were not ideologues. They weren't sitting around arguing philosophy. They were just trying to keep their families fed. They were just trying to keep their businesses open. And they were just trying to survive the whiplash of a society that no longer felt predictable. And when predictability disappears, people stop asking, is this right? And they instead start asking, will this make things stop spinning? And that shift from moral evaluation to emotional relief is where bad stories begin. The early solutions didn't sound extreme. They sounded practical. Restore order, reassert control, crack down on the chaos. Those words, they don't really scare people. They almost comfort them. Because you see, chaos is loud, and authority promises quiet. But here's the part people don't like to hear. The people enforcing those early measures didn't feel like oppressors. They felt like stabilizers. They believed they were preventing things from getting worse. They believed restraint was temporary. They believed someone else would step in if things went too far. But history shows us how dangerous that belief is. Nothing about the early phases felt like a moral cliff. It just felt like a slope. And the thing about slopes, they're tricky because you don't realize how far you've gone until climbing back up feels impossible. Every single step was framed as reasonable in isolation. Every new power came with a justification, and every restriction came with an explanation. And because each move followed the last, it felt continuous, not radical. That's how normalization works. And this is where hindsight messes us up. Looking back, we see a straight line. Living through it, people saw a series of adjustments. And that distinction matters. Because nobody wakes up thinking, I'm participating in something historically awful today. They wake up thinking, I just need to get through today. And there's a phrase that echoes through this period and through history more broadly. I'm just doing my job. Now that phrase, it doesn't sound violent. It sounds responsible. It sounds adult. It sounds like someone trying to survive within a system that they didn't design. And that's why it's so dangerous. Because systems don't require belief. They just require participation. Here's the part that really unsettles people when they sit with it. If you dropped most of us into that moment, without any hindsight, without documentaries, without ominous music telling us something bad was coming, most of us, we wouldn't have recognized it either. Because nothing felt like the end of the world just yet. It just felt like problem solving. And history is ruthless that way. It doesn't test societies with obvious moral choices. It tests them with trade-offs. And this is why saying, we would have known, is one of the most comforting lies we tell ourselves. History always suggests otherwise. People rarely know when they're in the early chapters of something truly awful. They just know later, when the cost of speaking up is higher, when the language has hardened, when questioning power feels dangerous instead of civic. So when we talk about Germany here, this isn't about comparison for shock value. It's about recognizing a sequence. Instability, fear, reassurance, expanded authority, normalization. That sequence doesn't belong to one single country. It belongs to how human beings respond to uncertainty. And here's why this matters for the rest of this episode. Because the early warning signs of moral collapse don't look like cruelty. They look like calm explanations. They look like official statements. They look like people telling you to just relax. They look like being told, trust us, this is all under control. That's why the ending is never where you should focus. Because by the time history looks unmistakably evil, it's already won. The real fight is in the beginning, when everything still sounds just a little reasonable. You know, there's a lie we all grew up believing. Words are just words. But they're not. Words are how we decide what's normal, who's dangerous, what's justified. Violence doesn't show up naked. It shows up wearing language that makes it feel reasonable. Think about how often you hear phrases like, well, that is unfortunate, but it was necessary. They didn't leave them a choice. This is all about safety. Those sentences don't sound extreme, do they? And that's the point. They're designed to lower your guard, not raise it. And here's something history makes very clear over and over and over again. Authoritarian systems don't start by telling people what to think. They start by narrowing the vocabulary of what can be questioned. Once certain words become default, threat, chaos, security, order, the conversation, it's already tilted. Because now you're not debating what happened. You're debating whether you're allowed to question it at all. And this is why slogans matter so damn much. You see, a slogan is an entire worldview packed into a sentence short enough to repeat without thinking. It bypasses analysis and goes straight for emotion. Belonging, duty, fear, identity. And that's not accidental. It's by design. So how about we talk about something very specific and very real? You see, over the last little bit, watchdog groups, journalists, and civil rights organizations have raised concerns about federal law enforcement recruitment messaging, including DHS and ICE, using language and imagery that echoes rhetoric long associated with white nationalist and extremist movements. And not because someone sat in a room and said, "Hey guys, let's do Nazi stuff." That's not necessarily how institutions work. But because certain phrases, defending the homeland, answering the call, protecting civilization, warrior framing against internal threats, those things carry historical baggage whether you acknowledge it or not. And extremists notice that baggage almost immediately. But here's the important part, and listen closely, because nuance definitely matters here. This is not about saying every DHS or ICE agent believes extremist ideology. That's just lazy thinking. This is about something much more structural and more dangerous. It's about the state using language that overlaps with the same rhetorical toolbox extremists use. And when that overlap happens, it creates permission. Not permission from the top, but permission in the middle. Because once language blurs the line between law enforcement and combat, between public safety and internal enemy, between order and obedience, the system starts attracting people who want the vibes of power, but not the responsibility of restraint. History, well, it is very clear about that. So let me put this in plain terms. If a recruitment slogan can be comfortably posted in a government press release and also feel at home in an extremist forum, that should set off every alarm bell known to man. Not because they're the same exact thing, but because language has lost its guardrails. And once language loses guardrails, behavior always follows next. Always. And this is why, well, it's just marketing. It's such a weak-ass defense. Marketing is how values spread. Recruitment is how culture reproduces itself. You don't recruit anyone with neutral language. You recruit with what you want people to feel. And when what you want people to feel is power over others, history tells us exactly how that ends. So let's bring this back to the present, because this is where the rhyme begins to tighten. When federal agents use lethal force and the immediate response is a clean, confident narrative, when words like threat and necessity appear before evidence is even publicly reviewed, when dissent gets framed as disorder, that's language doing all the work. And I mean heavy work. It's setting the boundary between who deserves empathy and who deserves suspicion, between who gets protected and who gets explained away. And this is the part people really struggle with. They want to believe language follows reality, but in moments like this, reality follows language. And once you've decided someone is a threat, the rest, well, it just becomes paperwork. And this is why history treats words as evidence. Because by the time force shows up, the language has already won the entire argument. So no, words don't pull the trigger, but they make pulling the trigger feel inevitable. And once something feels inevitable, accountability becomes optional. And this is the danger zone. Not when people are screaming, but when they're calmly explaining. Not when the language is hateful, But when it's professional, that's when history starts rhyming so loud that you can't ignore it anymore. And that brings me to the moment where all of this stops being abstract. Because language didn't just set the stage, it helped shape a narrative after someone was executed. So let's talk about what actually happened. Not the story the officials wanted you to hear first, but what evidence and accounts in the aftermath pushed into the light. On January 24th, 2026, Alex Pretti, the 37-year-old ICU nurse at the VA hospital in Minneapolis, was shot and killed by a U.S. Border Patrol agent during a federal immigration enforcement operation. Immediately, the story hit the air like it was already pre-written. He approached threateningly with a gun. He was a violent threat. He resisted. It was completely justified. It was clean, fast, a little too convenient. But here's where everything changed. Because cameras, well, they do what they do best. And the videos that came out didn't match the version people were being pushed to accept. Because you see in the footage what you can actually see in his hands, in the moment the state decided he was the problem, was just a cell phone. Not a raised weapon, not some active threat on display, a phone. And yeah, I'm going to say it the way it deserves to be said. That's the only thing he ever brandished. A cell phone. Recording live in 1080p, baby. And that matters. Because when someone faces violence from the state, the immediate official explanation shouldn't beat the evidence to the public by a mile. But you know what? It did. And when video contradicts the narrative, that gap gets super loud. And that's where the danger of language meets the reality of evidence. Now, and this part needs to be said plainly, without euphemism. A phone, you see, is exactly the sort of thing authoritarian power structures absolutely hate. Because you see, my friends, a phone democratizes accountability. A phone collapses official narratives. A phone shows you what the cameras the state controls don't always show you. And it's not some accident that the first stories about the shooting were so clean and so convenient. So let's talk about something else that should have been loud, but it really wasn't. Because Alex Pretti was also a lawful concealed carry permit holder. That means he legally owned and carried, which is relevant because it collapses a lot of easy narratives people like to use. But there is irony here. People on the right, the same crowd that spent years holding up the Second Amendment like it was a talisman, the same crowd that celebrated armed actors in other public moments, were in, well, many cases, pretty fucking quiet or passive when someone lawfully carrying, filming, and trying to help somebody on the ground got executed anyway. People who have defended the right to bear arms against a tyrannical government suddenly went very silent when that principle had to be applied to someone who was not them. And just let that contrast sit with you for a second. Armed vigilante vibes in public, high fives and viral posts. But a lawful gun owner holding a cell phone camera while trying to help a defenseless woman, painted as a threat before the smoke even cleared. But nobody wants to talk about that. And that's not accidental. That's agenda and comfort and identity politics all wrapped up into one contradiction. The Second Amendment is a holy text until someone on the other side exercises their rights. When Alex exercised his rights and his humanity, people who historically championed the idea of civilian resistance suddenly found their principles really inconvenient. And that silence, that triangulation, that's what power relies on. Not uniform consent, not unanimous agreement, but apathy and inconsistency. And that feels wrong. Because it is fucking wrong. Because the only thing Alex really had in his hand, the thing that posed the most threat to the official narrative, was a phone recording the truth. And for that, he was executed on a public street while federal agencies got an early narrative out into the world. That's not just violence. That's message control. And it's exactly why understanding this incident isn't rhetorical. It's essential, because here's the thing that makes the Alex Pretti case impossible to shrug off. It didn't happen in a vacuum. What happened after his death, the language, the framing, the silence, the selective outrage, that's the tell. Because once you step back, you start seeing the same move over and over and over and over again. When the state murders someone it shouldn't have, the next battle isn't about what happened. It's about who that person is allowed to be. Victim or threat, human being or problem. Because if you can successfully reframe someone as dangerous, unstable, or domestic, you don't have to grapple with what you did to them. You just have to justify it. This is why the phrase domestic terrorist gets thrown around so damn casually now. Not because it's accurate, it's just useful. Once that label enters the chat, everything else gets easier. Questions become suspicious. Witnesses become biased. Video becomes out of context. Outrage becomes overreaction. The label does all the fucking work. When federal agencies start stretching that label, when they apply it to people whose real crime is just being present, asking questions, or recording, that's not about safety anymore. That's all about control. Because terrorist, it's not just a word, it's a permission slip. It gives the state moral cover to act first and explain later, if at all. I mean, seriously, look at how fast Alex Pretti was framed. Before an independent investigation, before anyone outside the chain of command weighed in, the story was already written. He was dangerous. He was armed. He was a threat. Except, the evidence pushed back. So instead of accountability, we got something else entirely. Deflection, and a whole lot of people suddenly finding reasons just to not talk about it. And this is where I need to say something plainly, because the silence is fucking loud. Where are the usual Second Amendment protects us from tyranny people right now? Because I watched a whole chunk of the right cheer Kyle Rittenhouse like he was an action hero. And I watched January 6th get hand-waved while people showed up armed and furious. And suddenly we're supposed to accept without question that a lawful concealed carry guy is a domestic terrorist hell-bent on maximum damage. Because the government said so? Absolutely not. If your principles only apply to people you already agree with, then they're not fucking principles. They're costumes. And in this case, the thing that really got treated like a threat was not a gun. It was a phone. Because a phone turns state power into evidence, and evidence is the only thing authoritarian instincts cannot bully. So if recording the truth is enough to get you framed as a threat, then the problem is not just one bad agent. It's a culture that has decided visibility is dangerous. And history has a very specific name for that kind of culture. And trust me when I tell you, it never ends well. Oh, and just real quick, before I move on, I already know the meme that's going to get posted in association with this episode. I've seen it, it sounds clever, but it collapses the second you add context. It goes something like this. So getting shot while running for president or while speaking on a college campus is fine. But getting shot after pulling a gun on a federal officer is outrageous. And I'm like, okay. But this only works if we pretend intent doesn't exist, context doesn't exist, and power doesn't exist. So, how about we put those back in? Because you see, an assassination attempt is targeted violence. Somebody is picked because of who they are and what they represent. That's why it's treated like an attack on democracy. It's meant to silence someone through fear. A police or federal officer shooting is a completely different category. It happens during enforcement. That does not automatically make it justified. It just means it has to be investigated. Threat level, proportionality, last resort. And here's what memes never want to talk about. When the state uses lethal force, it's not just someone got shot. It's the government exercising the most extreme power it has at its disposal. And accountability? It's the entire point. So yes, you can condemn political violence and condemn unjustified killings by law enforcement. That should not be fucking controversial. What's propaganda is flattening everything into someone got shot and using that to shut down critical thinking. But let me get back on track, because here's the part of the story that always gets rushed. Once the headlines fade, once the clips stop circulating, once the talking points move on, what's left is usually just silence. And you know what? Silence is incredibly useful. Silence is how systems survive their own mistakes. Because you see, outrage, it burns hot, but it burns fast. And memory lingers. And that's the thing power is actually afraid of. Alex Pretti wasn't the first person murdered by ICE or federal immigration enforcement. He just so happened to die in a moment when cameras were rolling, and when the gap between the official story and reality was impossible to ignore. But if you zoom out, you see a clear pattern that stretches back years. People killed during raids, people killed during wellness checks, people killed during enforcement operations that were later described as necessary, tragic, but regrettable, and then quietly moved past. You see, names become footnotes, lives become statistics, context disappears entirely. And every single time the same move gets made. First, justify the use of force. Then, question the victim. Then, exhaust the public. Then, wait. Because eventually, most people stop paying attention. And not because they're heartless, but because the system is designed to outlast their attention spans. And this is why the language of domestic terrorism is so damn dangerous when it's stretched thin. Because once someone is labeled a threat, remembering them feels risky. Once someone is framed as dangerous, asking questions feels suspicious. And once asking questions feels suspicious, silence, it feels much safer. And that's not an accident. That's by design. Just think about how quickly narratives flip. One day it's, we need transparency. And then the next it's, let's wait for the official investigation. Then after that it's, well, this is complicated. Then after that it's, why are you still talking about this? And that last question is the tell. Because you see, history doesn't erase people by denying what happened. It erases them by just moving on. And if you think this is just about one incident, one man, one terrible day, that's exactly how systems survive accountability, by making every single case feel isolated. And here's where I need to zoom out again for just a second, because Alex Pretti didn't die in isolation. What happened in Minneapolis this month wasn't just a one-off tragic misunderstanding. It was part of a surge of federal immigration enforcement where multiple people have been murdered. And every single time the same reflex kicks in. The state reaches for a story that protects itself first. And what makes it feel so rotten to the core is how fast the framing shows up. Before the public sees any of the videos, before independent reviews, before anyone outside the chain of command can even breathe, we get the federal officers acted in self-defense. We get domestic terror threat. We get dangerous. And then, when video contradicts it, when reality doesn't cooperate, the story doesn't get corrected with the same urgency it was launched with. The lie gets a head start, and the truth has to fight uphill. And I need to say this plainly. Calling ordinary people exercising their rights domestic terrorists because they protested, because they witnessed, because they recorded, that is not public safety language. That's intimidation language. That's the state trying to make visibility feel like a crime. Because the one thing power can't stand is a public that keeps receipts. This is why remembering names absolutely matters. Not as a slogan and not as a fucking hashtag, but as a refusal. A refusal to let someone be reduced to incident or situation or use of force. Alex Pretti was a person. He had a job, a family, and he had a life outside of a police report. And the state tried to flatten all of that into a threat narrative quickly before the evidence could get traction. And that, my friends, is not justice. That's reputation laundering. And here's the part that should really fucking unsettle you. The system doesn't need you to agree with what happened. It just needs you to forget it, because forgetting is functionally the same as approval. You see, history is full of moments where people later said, "Why didn't anyone do anything?" The uncomfortable answer is usually, people did. For a while. Then they got tired. Then something else happened. And then something else happened. And then something else happened. And the names faded. This is exactly why authoritarian systems fear journalists, why they fear cameras, why they fear witnesses above all. Because evidence creates memory, and memory creates accountability. So let me say this as clearly as I can. The opposite of oppression is not outrage, it's record. It's writing things down, it's saying names out loud, it's refusing to let language erase what actually happened. Because the moment we stop remembering, the pattern resets itself. And history, well, it gets another verse. So no, this episode is not about predicting the future. It's about refusing to forget the present we're living in. And it's about saying, this happened, it mattered, and we're not moving on just because it's uncomfortable. In all of this, I'm not trying to declare that we're already living in some dystopia. And I'm not trying to say history is destiny. History is not fate, but it's feedback. It's the record of what happens when certain patterns go unchallenged long enough that they stop feeling wrong. Nothing I've talked about today started with evil intentions. That's the part people really struggle with. It started with fear, urgency, explanations, people saying this is necessary. It started with power moving quickly and accountability moving slowly. That's always how it starts. The most dangerous lie we tell ourselves is that history announces itself, that it comes with alarms and banners and obvious villains. But it doesn't. It shows up as press releases, as official statements, as phrases like justified, necessary, and under investigation. It shows up when violence is explained before it's examined. And here's the part that matters the absolute most. Paying attention to what's happening around you is not radical. It's not unpatriotic, it's not dangerous, and it damn sure isn't overreacting. Paying attention is the bare minimum responsibility of living in a society where power is supposed to answer to the people. When that starts being framed as suspicious, that's the warning sign. Alex Pretti didn't die because he was violent. He didn't die because he was a threat. He didn't die because he broke any imagined law. He died because he was watching, because he was recording, because he was present and refused to look away. And the response to his death told us far more than any official statement ever could. If recording the truth is treated as hostility, if questioning the narrative is treated as danger, if silence becomes the safest option, then something fundamental has already shifted, and history has a very clear opinion about what comes next. This is not left versus right. It's not about parties or teams. It's about whether we still believe that power should be held accountable before it's comfortable. Because the moment we decide accountability is optional, we've already given up more than we realize. So no, the call to action here is not panic. It's presence. It's memory. It's refusing to let names disappear just because the news cycle moved on. It's refusing to accept explanations that don't match the evidence. It's refusing to treat discomfort as danger. And that's why that line matters. History does not repeat itself, but it damn sure rhymes. And the only way to stop the rhyme from finishing is to hear it early and say, no, not this time. And that's it. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, thank you. Genuinely. This probably wasn't an easy listen, but it wasn't really meant to be. This was one of those conversations that ask you to sit with discomfort instead of scrolling right past it. And the fact that you stayed means you're willing to do that work. And that absolutely matters to me. If this episode stuck with you, if it made you pause, rewind, or just sit quietly for just a second, I want you to share it. Not to argue with people online and not to own anyone, but share it with someone you trust. Share it with someone who says, I just want to understand what in the hell is going on. Someone who still believes context matters. That's how these conversations stay human. And if you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or really wherever you get your podcasts, please make sure you're following the show. Also, ratings and reviews might feel small, but they genuinely help more than people realize. They tell the algorithm this is not noise. This is substance. And if you want to keep these conversations going, not just this topic, but really anything, come hang out with us in the Average Joe Nerdcast community on Facebook. I'll post the group link in the show notes. Or you can just head right over to Facebook and in the search bar, just search Average Joe Nerdcast, the lobby, and you will find the page. That's where episode ideas come from, and it's also where we have a bit of fun. The lobby's always open. So as always, shout out to my player 2 for being my sounding board, my compass, and the person who keeps me grounded when these conversations get heavy. And shout out to everyone behind the scenes. You know exactly who you are. For all the late night texts, the reality checks, and the constant reminder that community is how you survive moments just like this. But most importantly, shout out to each and every one of you for listening, for thinking, for remembering names when the news cycle wants you to just forget them, for understanding that paying attention is not radical, it's responsible. Before I close, I want to do something that should be obvious, but it so often gets lost in official statements and the spin cycle. I want to say some names. People who have died under ICE custody or in encounters with federal immigration enforcement. And I want us to remember them not as cases, but as human beings whose lives were cut too damn short. Geraldo Lunis Campos, Victor Manuel Diaz, Renee Nicole Good, Alex Pretti, Keith Porter Jr. There are others, individuals who died in detention or during enforcement operations whose deaths are part of this broader pattern of oversight failures, violence, and questionable decision-making. These were all real people. They had families. They had stories. They had roles in their communities. And when systems turn human lives into footnotes and backlogs, we lose more than just names. We lose memory, accountability, and we lose the chance to notice the rhyme before it completes itself. So yeah, say their names, not for politics, but for remembrance. And because history remembers the people who were there, not the narrative spun about them. Don't forget, stay gold, nerd bold, and don't look away. I'll catch you on the next one. Oh, and one more thing before I get out of here. Because while I was creating this episode, the ground shifted. Greg Bovino, the Border Patrol commander who had been the public face of ICE operations in Minnesota, is no longer in charge there. He's been pulled back, reassigned, moved out of the spotlight. And you're going to hear a lot of careful language about that. Routine, not a firing, nothing to see here. But here's what is worth seeing. The guy who stood behind the narrative, the guy who defended the operation, the guy attached, publicly to what happened to Alex Pretti is suddenly not running the show anymore. That doesn't mean accountability happened. It doesn't mean justice showed up late to the party. But it does tell you something. When the narrative starts cracking, power does not apologize. It rearranges. And if nothing else, that timing should tell you this story is not over, no matter how badly some people want it to be. All right, that's it. I'll see you down the road.